Hey everybody, it's Wednesday night at 6:30. It's time for our Lucan Bible study. Tonight we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 2, verses 41 to 52, and I'm affectionately calling this When Jesus Was a Punk Teenager. So hear now the word of the Lord. Each year his parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When Jesus was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to their custom. After the festival was over, they were returning home, but the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it. Supposing that he was among their band of travelers, they journeyed on for a full day while looking for him among their family and friends. When they didn't find Jesus, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple. He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and putting questions to them. Everyone who heard him was amazed by his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were shocked. His mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Listen, your father and I have been worried. We've been looking for you." Jesus replied, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" But they didn't understand what he said to them. Jesus went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. His mother cherished every word in her heart. Jesus matured in wisdom and years and in favor with God and with people. So remember that we're going to look at this through the lens of Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience in our very Wesleyan tradition. So first, let's pay attention to what we learn here in Scripture. First, we learn that this happened when Jesus was 12. Now, 12 years old at the time for Jews and for much of society, actually to some extent still in the Jewish tradition, 12 was considered right on the cusp between childhood and adulthood. And that's why I say Jesus was a teenager instead of saying that he was a preteen, because really 12 in this time of our human history would have been more like the equivalent of being 17 or maybe the equivalent of being 20, right before you turn 21. So right on the verge of having all of those privileges of adulthood. So that's an important piece to remember. He's right in that kind of liminal state. Also, some people ask whenever we read this passage, how did Mary and Joseph go a full day without noticing that Jesus was in their traveling group? Well, let's think in terms of the context for the time, right? So people would go to these big festivals like the Passover festival. They would go in caravans. They would go in large groups. There was safety in numbers, less likelihood of getting robbed when you're on the road. So they would travel in large groups together. And there was a real sense of community that we were all sort of in this together, raising our kids together, being part of each other's lives. So they wouldn't have necessarily noticed. They would have just assumed he was with the group and that he would catch up with them usually at nighttime, because at night was when everyone would gather in their family units and have dinner and kind of collect all together there. So it wouldn't have been till nighttime when he didn't show up in their family unit and they would have walked around and asked, "Hey, have you seen Jesus?" that they would have suddenly noticed that he was not with them. And you can imagine the panic that would happen for parents to realize that they didn't have their kid with them after a day's worth of travel. So that causes them to run back to Jerusalem. It takes them 3 days to find him, right? And then a couple of other things to notice about Scripture here is that they specifically say in verse 43, he is called the boy Jesus. In Greek, that's ho pais, which is really youth. But it's certainly not an adulthood stage. And then when Mary addresses him, when she says, his mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this?" She calls him child, and in Greek she calls him teknon, and that is definitely a child. So she is upset and has called him out and named that he is not an adult yet. Why is he behaving like this? So those are important little details for us to hold on to from the Scripture passage. So now let's think in terms of tradition. And the piece that I want to bring in with tradition is the debate as to whether Jesus was God or human. And this went on for centuries. perhaps in many ways is still going on. But it was really in about the 400s that we kind of came to the collective decision that Jesus is both fully God and fully human. This is the sort of doctrine of hypostasis, that both God and human exist in the one body. The understanding of the hypostatic union was affirmed in the Athanasian Creed. It was taken up for debate by the Council of Ephesus in 431, and then debated again at the Council of, some people say Chalcedon, some people say Chalcedon, in 451. But basically by that point, we decided that Jesus was fully God and fully human in the same body. And I want us to hold on to this because this is a very human description that we have here of what it would be like for a human body to contain God. I think we're seeing some of the pressure of that in this moment. And in fact, in the verse before this that I did not read, in verse 40, it talks about how Jesus was filled with wisdom, was growing in wisdom. And in verse 52, as we heard, we learn that he has matured in wisdom in years. So it's not that the fullness of God's wisdom existed in the body. The body had to sort of catch up with the wisdom of God. And so it's there's some bumps in the road, right? Okay, so let's think about that reality, right? The reality of the human body has limitations of growth. It has limitations of understanding. We also have to throw in the reality of teenagers with their surging hormones that give them all sorts of different moods and reactions. And if God came to fully incarnate in a human body, then God came to experience that reality of the human body. And so it is fully present. The realities of the human body are fully present as Jesus is manifest in it. You also have to recognize that there's a cultural moment here between childhood and adulthood, right? And as I mentioned, that's a liminal state. And Jesus, who is fully vested and invested in being part of this community and being part of the human community, would have those similar realities on him as well. So it's reasonable to assume that Jesus would have some teenagery moments, right? This is the only story that we have in the Gospels of Jesus between really birth and adulthood. This is it. And maybe it's because he was quite the teenager, right? So this is the moment that we have to kind of reflect on that. And so I want us to think about that reality of being a teenager and of having teenagers, right? Like, have you ever met a teenager? This is a very teenagery moment that we're seeing in Jesus. Presumably, if you haven't met a teenager, which I can't imagine, you've been a teenager, right? And so we get this. We have these moments of sort of trying to assert our own authority, our own identity, and how that runs up against our parents. So for those of us that are raising teenagers, this is also a very real moment for us as well. There's a real tension here between he has claimed his own identity, has stayed behind in Jerusalem, he is engaged in this discussion in the temple, but he's disregarded his parents and caused them deep panic. They thought that they've lost him. They've spent days looking for him. You can just imagine how frantic that would be. So of course, when Mary comes in, she's like, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Like, this is not how you are a good son, right? Don't do this." And then Jesus has this moment where he says, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" Now, Joseph is standing right there. And I just, part of me feels the knife that must have been for Joseph, right? Who is your father, right? Okay, yes, God's your father, but I've been raising you, dadgummit, right? That's a real tense moment right there, right? And one of the things that I think is telling about what probably happened in there is what's not written. So he says, "Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" but they didn't understand what he said to him. That just recognizes that misunderstanding that so often happens between parents and children. It also, of course, recognizes the misunderstanding that happens between God and humans as well. But I think right there in that moment, there's also that family dynamic that's definitely at work there. But after that, after the didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house, then we have this verse. Jesus went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. What happened between the I had to be in my Father's house and I'm going to go be obedient? I think those of us that have been parents can certainly imagine that. And certainly those of us that have been children can also imagine what happened in that moment. That there was literally a kind of come to Jesus moment in that space, right? So for us, in this reality where we are now, when so many of us are homeschooling our children, when we are around our kids, or if we're kids, we're around our parents more than we thought we were going to be, and we're struggling as parents to try and manage homeschool and work, or if you're a kid, you're trying to manage the fact that your parents are way too much in your face right now, then I just want us to all take solace and take heart that Jesus and his parents also had these moments too. And it's a reality of being human. It's a reality of being family. That we have to make room for each other, but we also have to sort of follow the rules and be attentive to the responsibilities that we have in our family. But I also recommend that we cut each other some slack, because if we can see it here in Jesus and his family, then of course it's going to be present in our families as well. So I wish you all the best as you navigate this reality of being family in these closed quarters, but also to remember the gift that we're given. Mary treasures all these things in her heart. She treasures all these things, even those moments, in her heart. And let's remember to stop and treasure the gift that we've been given of our families in this time. So it's been great sharing this word with you. Next week we'll look at Jesus' ministry beginning. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll see you next Wednesday at 6:30, and blessings and prayers for you all during this time. Thanks.